Mid-flight, the pilot collapses. No co-pilot, no second chance. 30,000 feet in the air, and one man stands up. He's not a pilot, he's Big Shaq. But when a hidden device reveals the flight was never meant to land, what he uncovers will shake the nation. This isn't just about saving lives, it's about exposing a truth the skies tried to bury. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The cabin lights glimmer in the soft golden glare of midday sun, as passengers settle into their seats. The hum of conversation drifts through the cabin, mingling with the low whir of engines. Amid them, a man stands out, not through extravagance, but by the calm authority rippling from his frame. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal steps into the aisle, his height forcing others to glance upward. He offers a warm grin to the flight attendants, accepts a handshake or a nod from the crew, and exchanges polite words with passengers. He navigates the rows, recognizing people, offering reassurance. He helps an elderly woman with her overhead bag, steadying it as though it were as precious as a fragile heirloom. She pauses, looks up at him with surprise and gratitude. In that moment, the world seems to shrink, just between Shaq and that quiet passenger, and for a second she doesn't see a celebrity. She sees only compassion. Nearby, a mother tries to calm her crying toddler. Shaq crouches, his voice low, comforting the child with a few gentle words, and a quick pat on the back, eliciting a shy giggle. The mother's tension eases, her shoulders relaxing while she watches him speak. He turns to board the flight with modesty, nodding to the pilot and co-pilot before moving down the aisle. Subtle tensions drift beneath the civilized calm. A man with tight shoulders shifts uneasily as Shaq passes. His brief glance seems intent on suspicion. A woman on the other side grips her purse a bit tighter when he nods at her. Their discomfort, faint, almost imperceptible, drifts in the air, a soft undercurrent to polite smiles and perfunctory pleasantries. Shaq senses nothing, carries on. Settling into his own seat, he places a gentle pause on the armrest of the seat beside him, an insurance against abrupt movements. He smiles at the flight attendant who helps him, and she offers a small, respectful nod before adjusting her uniform. Around him, murmurs rise in respectful tones from those who recognize him, though he avoids fanfare. Instead, he opens a small book, its cover unassuming, and scans a few lines thoughtfully. The engines roar a notch louder as the plane pushes back from the gate, and passengers lean back as the flight begins its ascent. Sunlight glints off the wings as the aircraft lifts into the open sky. Shaq watches the moving clouds slide past the oval window, his expression thoughtful. Beneath his calm exterior, a soft tension coils, a feeling he recognizes from every time life has demanded more than expected. Today, though, it's nothing more than a whisper. Yet as the cruising altitude is reached and the seatbelt signs blink off, the aircraft makes a few minor dips, almost playful. Children giggle at the wobble, but the grown-ups tense. It's nothing dangerous, just a reminder of gravity's influence. Shaq glances around. He sees concern on the face of a young business traveler. His height, reaching for his tablet as though that might ground him. Lower down, the flight attendant moves to resume beverage service. Shaq offers to help. She smiles, accepts with relief, and he hands bottled water to passengers. A conversation drifts his way. "Thank you, Big Shaq," says one of the flight attendants, and others nod with familiarity. A few moments later, the gentle drops turn into sharper, more insistent dips. The seatbelt chime rings again. The captain's voice, tinny and measured, warns of moderate turbulence ahead. The plane quivers, and then quakes, with more pronounced shudders. Drinks rattle, straps tighten. The pilot then says, "Folks, we're entering a tougher patch. Please remain seated." The cabin grows quiet, tension coiling tighter. Shaq grips the seat in front of him, his arms steady and sure. He watches the lines of passengers. Some clutch phones, some whisper prayers, others stare at the ceiling. A mother hushes her toddler. The world is still moving, only faster now, more uncertain. Shaq looks down the aisle, meeting anxious expressions with quiet reassurance. That kind of reassurance that doesn't grandstand or spotlight. It simply exists. When the turbulence crescendos, the flight attendant leaps into action, pressing the service card into stow. A hiss of air rattles through the vents. Every eye flicks upward toward the cockpit door, as if the pilots might call for help at any second. Shaq clenches and unclenches his fists once, twice. For many, this is discomfort, For him, it awakens lived experience. A reminder, life is never predictable, and sometimes the skies give no warning. In that grinding moment, the sense of ordinary order fractures. The pilot's voice crackles again. We're hitting some serious atmospheric activity. Remain seated. Behind that calm tone, panic could show. The plane labors upward, each shudder echoing through the fuselage, like subtle knocks on a door demanding attention. And through it all, Shaq sits quiet, poised. He glances at the elderly woman he helped earlier. She nods to him once, eyes wide, tentatively trusting. He offers her a small smile, squeezed just under his breath. The flight attendant, across the aisle, locks eyes with him, as though drawing confidence from his stillness. A few passengers lean into their defenses, turning away. Others stiffen, hands clenched. In this reference frame of shaking steel inside the sky, Shaq feels himself returning to a moment he thought he'd left behind. Another crisis, another instant demanding action. But this time, there's no urgency beyond calm. No sirens, no pain, just turbulence. Yet turbulence is enough. The plane rises and falls like a living creature, breath curled in metal wings. The chime signals once more. Turbulence easing. Social breaths are exhaled. The child stops crying. The businessman relaxes his jaw. The flight attendant reappears, voice calm as she announces the dip is passing. Shaq sits tall. The clouds fragment before the windows, thinning to serene blue sky. Ordinary resumes. But no one is quite the same as before. Turbulence taught the cabin humility on its wings. Shaq's presence is a tether, a quiet reminder that calm matters. Not to silence fear, but to steady it. The flight resumes its smooth course, but the air remains charged with something different. A foreshadowing. Because sometimes, it isn't the turbulence that changes everything. It's what comes after. Sure, I'll now write the next section titled, "This will maintain the cinematic, emotionally driven tone, while deepening suspense and staying true to the grounded realism and tension needed for this part of the story." The skies outside had cleared, revealing a blanket of soft white clouds beneath a bright blue canopy. Inside the cabin, conversations began again, hushed and tentative like people were still shaking off the recent turbulence. A flight attendant pushed her cart slowly through the aisle, offering refreshments to passengers who now seemed eager for a return to routine. Shaq remained in his seat, arms crossed lightly over his chest, eyes narrowed not from worry, but from the sense that something still wasn't quite right. The subtle hum of the engines continued, a familiar lullaby in the background of every flight. Then, without warning, a violent jolt tore through the aircraft. The cabin tilted slightly. Trays slipped from hands, cups tumbled, and some passengers yelped, gripping armrests or clutching loved ones. The plane didn't drop far, but the suddenness was jarring. Alarms didn't go off. No voice crackled over the intercom. Just the heavy, unnatural silence that follows a disruption without explanation. A flight attendant hurried toward the cockpit, her face taut, professional composure barely holding. Seconds passed, then another tremor hit, not as intense, but enough to rattle overhead bins and shake confidence loose. Passengers looked at one another, questioning what no one could answer. Eyes darted toward the cockpit door, still sealed. The silence was now deafening. Something was wrong. Then the door to the cockpit flung open with urgency, and the same flight attendant stumbled into the aisle, eyes wide, mouth moving too fast for her voice to keep up. Her words came out in a strangled breath. He's unconscious. The captain just collapsed." The words didn't land immediately. Confusion blinked across faces. Then a wave of realization surged like an undertow. The pilot, the only pilot, was no longer conscious. Shaq stood up slowly, towering above the row as heads turned toward the voice that had spoken those dreadful words. Another attendant rushed forward, trying to maintain order, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "Please stay seated," she said. "We were contacting ground control." But behind the curtain of protocol, panic was breaking its surface. One passenger, a man in a navy blazer, half rose from his seat. "Is this a joke? How does a pilot collapse mid-flight?" His voice was loud, trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Where's the co-pilot?" A murmur followed, eyes now fixating on the cockpit, as if staring hard enough would reveal answers. The flight attendant's voice faltered. "The co-pilot wasn't on this flight. There was a last-minute crew change. He didn't show." A void opened in the collective sense of safety. No backup, no one at the controls. A plane at cruising altitude with no one flying it. The gravity of the moment eclipsed everything else. Shaq didn't speak. Not yet. He stepped into the aisle, steadying himself against the occasional bump of air. His calmness wasn't an act. It was how he had always carried fear, pressed beneath resolve. Passengers looked up at him now, not because of his fame, but because instinctively, they were searching for a center. He made his way toward the cockpit, one slow step at a time, as if any sudden movement might tip the entire situation into chaos. Inside the cockpit, the scene was haunting. The pilot, a man in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, still strapped into his seat, slumped over the controls. His eyes were shut, mouth slightly open, face drained of color. One of the flight attendants stood frozen near him, not sure whether to touch him or scream. Shaq knelt beside the seat, gently reaching across to check for a pulse the way he'd been taught years ago. In an off-season community CPR workshop, the pilot was alive, shallow pulse, breathing slow, but unresponsive. Shaq turned to the control panel, an intricate constellation of blinking lights and switches. It looked nothing like the flight simulators he'd played with for fun, but there were familiar shapes. He didn't touch anything. Instead, he asked, calm but firm, "Is ground control on the line?" The flight attendant nodded, hands shaking. "They're patching someone through now." A headset was lifted from the pilot's console and handed to Shaq. A voice came through, tinny but clear. "This is flight communications. Who am I speaking with?" "This is Shaquille O'Neal," he said without hesitation. "We have a situation. The pilot is unconscious, and there's no co-pilot. I'm not a trained aviator, but I've got flight simulator hours. I need guidance, now." There was a pause, a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then professionalism kicked in. "Copy that, Shaquille. We're routing an experienced instructor onto this line. We'll work through this one step at a time." Back in the cabin, the whispers grew louder, worry hardening into panic. A woman in business attire stood up, pressing her phone to her ear, trying desperately to get a signal to call her family. A man at the back began praying audibly. Another tried to force his way toward the cockpit, yelling, "Let me in, I flew in the military. I should be up there." The flight attendants moved quickly to intercept him, not with force but with urgency, arms outstretched to block his way. "Sir, we've got someone handling it. Please return to your seat." He resisted for a moment, then saw who was in the cockpit. Recognition spread across his face. "Wait, that's Shaq?" And somehow, hearing his name was enough to break the panic. A momentary pause fell over the cabin, as if the situation was still dire. But now, there was an anchor. Shaq sat in the left seat, the pilot's seat, headset on. The voice in his ear belonged to a seasoned flight instructor now. Calm, precise. "We're going to walk you through basic control, Mr. O'Neal. Don't worry about the landing yet. First, keep the plane stable." His fingers hovered just above the control yoke. Every movement mattered. He thought of all the years under pressure. Buzzer beaters, playoff games, moments where millions watched his every move. But none of that compared to this. This was different. This was survival. This was a test that had nothing to do with reputation, and everything to do with resolve. The instructor continued. "Check your attitude indicator. Align with horizon. We'll adjust speed next." The plane shuddered again. Not turbulence, just uneven trim. But to the passengers it felt like a plunge. Screams broke out. The elderly woman Shaq had helped earlier clutched her necklace. A child began to cry. Shaq steadied his breath, focused, adjusted slightly, easing the yoke, doing just enough to bring the plane's nose back to level. "I've got this," he murmured, not to anyone else, but to himself. A silent promise. Behind him a flight attendant stood watch, relaying calm updates to the cabin. "The situation is under control. We have contact with the tower. Please remain seated." But control was fragile. One wrong input, one failure in the system, and the outcome could shift. Shaq didn't dwell on that. Instead, he listened. He moved with care. He flew not as a pilot, but as a man refusing to surrender lives to fear. He looked back once, through the open cockpit door, at the sea of faces behind him. Diverse, anxious, human. They weren't just passengers. They were stories. They were children, parents, people with pain and purpose. In their eyes, he saw fear, but also hope. A hope now tethered to his hands. And the storm hadn't even truly begun. Great. Here is the third section of the story, written in cinematic prose, building rising tension and emotional stakes, while following the exact tone, flow, and character integrity as specified. Great. Here is the third section of the story, written in cinematic prose, building rising tension and emotional stakes, while following the exact tone, flow, and character integrity as specified. The air inside the cabin had thickened, not with smoke or lack of oxygen, but with something harder to breathe: fear. It crept between the rows, wound around the overhead bins, and pooled near the floor. The kind of fear that doesn't scream right away, but crouches quiet and watchful, until it's ready to pounce. At 30,000 feet, with the cockpit taken over by a man who wasn't trained to be there, fear had all the room it needed to evolve. Shaq could feel it through the walls of the cockpit. Even with the door closed, even with the instructor's voice steady in his ear, something was shifting behind him. He glanced toward the control panel, locked his grip on the yoke, and nodded to the flight attendant who stood at his side. "Keep the cabin calm," he said, without looking up. She gave a weak nod and stepped out, pulling the cockpit door shut behind her. Out in the aisle, that calm had already begun to fracture. It started quietly, a shuffling of feet, a couple whispering furiously to each other, then looking around as if the answers to their private fear might be written on someone else's face. Then came the refusal. A white man in his 60s, sharp suit wrinkled from hours of sitting, pointed a rigid finger at the black teenager seated beside him. "I want a new seat," he barked at the flight attendant. "I'm not sitting next to him." The boy stiffened, glancing sideways. He was no older than 17, earbuds pulled out, hands flat in his lap. He said nothing. He didn't move. But the man beside him did, leaning away as though proximity alone might taint him. The flight attendant leaned in, voice calm, but the man wasn't interested in reason. "I've seen the news," he said louder now, eyes darting from the teen to the rest of the cabin. "We all know what's happening here." 2 rows up, a woman snapped her head around, her face pale, her grip white-knuckled on her handbag. Wait, 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 what's happening here? Are you saying this was intentional?" Her voice pitched up an octave, desperation laced through every syllable. "Are we being hijacked?" The word hijack was all it took. Panic doesn't need a reason. It only needs an invitation. And that word was the perfect key. A murmur turned to voices. Voices turned to questions. Then someone shouted, "Where's the air marshal? Is there one on board?" A man stood suddenly, backpack still strapped to his chest. He raised his arms like a protester trying to prove peace. "I'm not who you think," he started, but the panic had already claimed the moment. Another passenger shouted, "What's in the bag?" and 3 others flinched like he'd lit a fuse. The flight attendant tried to intervene, pushing gently between them, but the emotional weight was too much for one person to hold. The crowd wasn't a mob yet, but the pressure was building. Accusations collided with paranoia. Every sideways glance became suspicion. Every silence became guilt. And then a voice that cut through it all, deep, grounded, unmistakable. "Enough." Shaq stood in the aisle, his shoulders broad enough to fill the narrow space, his presence massive, not just physically, but emotionally. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't even loud, but it carried, it quieted. He looked at the man still standing by the black teenager. "Sit down," he said, voice even. The man hesitated, then obeyed. Shaq didn't smile. He didn't soften. He turned slowly, looking from seat to seat, sweeping across the passengers who were now watching him, the way children watch a parent, not with fear but with the desperate hope that someone finally had control. "I don't know how to land a plane," he said, his voice like gravel soaked in certainty. "But I'm doing it, right now. So unless you plan on growing wings and flying us down yourself, I need silence. I need order. And I need you to act like human beings, not headlines." There was a beat, a pause. And in that pause, the cabin exhaled. Shaq crouched beside the teen. "You okay?" he asked quietly. The boy nodded. "Yeah." "Good." He looked back toward the man who had started it. "Don't do that again." Then he straightened, nodding once to the attendant, and returned to the cockpit. But the turbulence hadn't passed. It had simply shifted. Back in the pilot's seat, Shaq's knuckles whitened around the yoke. The instructor's voice buzzed in his ear, something about recalibrating altitude. He followed the instructions, hands steady, but his mind replayed what just happened in the cabin. It was happening again, not in the sky but inside people. Fear turning to blame, blame turning to hate. It reminded him of a day he rarely talked about. Years ago, In another crisis, Shaq had stood outside a burning rec center in New Jersey. A fire sparked by faulty wiring. Smoke so thick, the street disappeared into ash. Inside were 3 kids he'd met just hours before. Kids who'd asked him about basketball, about making it out, about dreams. He'd gone in twice, pulled 2 of them out. But the third, he shook the thought away. This wasn't then. This time he could still save everyone. Another jolt from the plane snapped him back. The autopilot had disengaged momentarily, and the plane dipped before he corrected. Passengers screamed. Alarms chirped and fell silent. The instructor's voice returned, more urgent now. "You okay up there?" "Yeah," Shaq said, adjusting the pitch. "Just turbulence, inside and out." In the back the tension hadn't vanished. It had simply learned to stay quiet. People were whispering again, but now it was controlled. The woman who'd screamed earlier was breathing into her hands, muttering apologies. The man with the backpack had taken it off and placed it in the aisle, showing its contents. A laptop, some books, nothing more. The teenager had put his earbuds back in, music blaring just loud enough to block out the world. The crew moved with renewed focus now. They began serving water. One attendant stopped and knelt beside a woman who was crying silently. She didn't ask why, she just sat with her. It wasn't harmony. It wasn't peace, but it was something closer to dignity. And in a cabin 30,000 feet above the earth, that was enough. Shaq kept his eyes forward. The sky ahead stretched in all directions, a blue void, hiding who knew how many more trials. But for now, he had the controls. He had a voice in his ear, and he had 172 people behind him, who were learning slowly that trust sometimes looks like a giant man in a tight seat, doing what no one else dared to. And the fear for now was caged. This continues the intense, suspenseful tone of the narrative while deepening emotional complexity and staying in strict alignment with your format and direction. The cabin behind him had quieted to a manageable murmur, but Shaq knew silence didn't mean peace. It only meant that fear had changed form. It had crawled into the seams, folded into every breath, and every cautious glance. He didn't let himself dwell on it, not when a new kind of tension had settled in the cockpit like a living thing. The pilot remained slumped in his seat, unconscious but stable. A flight attendant, standing just inside the cockpit door, clutched a binder with emergency procedures, flipping through it with hands that trembled more from pressure than turbulence. Shaq had already taken the headset, already connected to someone on the other side of the sky, someone calm, composed and hopefully more prepared than any of them. "Mr. O'Neill," came the voice again. A slight crackle in the audio. "We have you connected with a flight instructor from ground control. You're in command of Flight 708. Confirm that." Shaq exhaled slowly, the headset sitting snug over his shaved head. "I'm not a pilot," he said. "I've flown simulators. Hobby stuff. That's it. But I'm here. So yeah, I'm in." A beat passed. Then another voice. This one younger, more focused. "Shaquille, this is Captain Julian Reeves, flight trainer out of Atlanta. I'll walk you through it. First things first, put your hands on the yoke and keep your feet light on the rudder pedals. That plane is alive now, and it's listening to you." Shaq adjusted his long arms, fitting his massive frame into the pilot's seat, like a giant folding himself into something built for a different size of man. His knees brushed the underside of the console. The yoke felt smaller than it should have. The switches and gauges blinked like a foreign language written in Morse code. But there was no fear in his posture, just a deep, weighty focus. "Copy, Captain," Shaq said, locking his eyes on the artificial horizon. "I've got my hands on the yoke." Behind him, the flight attendant lingered. "You good?" she asked. "No," Shaq replied. "But I'm here. Go check on the cabin." She hesitated, then left him to the silence and the open sky. The instructor's voice came steady and rhythmic, a cadence Shaq could follow. "Adjust altitude. Check vertical speed. Monitor fuel gauge. Keep the wings level. The basics first. Build confidence before diving into complexity." Each command required effort, not just physically, but mentally. He had to keep every muscle steady, every reflex in check. The plane responded to him, tentatively at first, as if unsure of this new captain, but then smoother, more stable. Confidence didn't bloom, but it flickered. Outside the windshield, the clouds stretched in massive veils, glowing in the light of the midday sun. Inside the cockpit, a different weather system brewed. a storm of pressure, expectation, and memory. Shaquille, the instructor said, talk to me about fuel and engine gauges. Read them off. Shaq listed them, each digit echoing in the tiny chamber, every word measured. As he worked, the voice continued with instructions. Minor corrections, situational reminders. But somewhere in that rhythm, another voice slipped into his mind. His father's voice. Don't ever freeze, son. You're too big for that. If you freeze, you scare the whole room. He didn't freeze now, not outwardly. But something inside tugged at him. A memory, a gym in Newark. A fire alarm blaring, kids rushing to the exits, smoke pouring from a faulty heater. Shaq pushing his way in, while others pulled at his arms. He'd gone in twice, dragged 2 boys out, but the third never made it. And today, there were no flames. Just steel, sky, and silence. But it felt the same. The helplessness, the responsibility, the guilt you carry in advance, like armor or a curse. Altitude steady at 34,000, he reported. Good, said Captain Reeves. You've got a solid grip on the basics. We're going to shift to nav planning next. You'll be rerouted toward Dallas. More open runways, better approach conditions. A beep sounded near the control panel. A notification from the plane's guidance system. Shaq tapped the screen gently, verifying. Confirmed, he said. Shaquille. Reeves said again, a little softer now. You doing all right up there? Shaq hesitated. He stared out the window at the endless blue. I'm not scared of crashing, he said. I'm scared of not being enough. There was silence on the line for a breath. Then nobody who says that ever really fails. Let's focus. Turn heading 270. Shaq adjusted the heading slowly, the plane easing into a new direction. The smooth shift helped. It felt like progress. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin was holding. No more outbursts. No more accusations. People sat in a heavy quiet, watching the sky beyond their windows, and the future written in the hands of a man most only knew from highlight reels and talk shows. They didn't see the sweat on his neck or the grip marks on the yoke. They saw only that he hadn't quit, and that was enough for now. The instructor kept speaking, guiding him through autopilot systems, holding patterns, emergency procedures. Shaq listened to every word, digested each one, then acted. But doubt hovered, not from himself, but from what he imagined outside. What would happen when this plane landed? What headlines would twist the story? What voices would ask why a man like him was in that seat? Would they trust it was duty, not ego? Would they whisper about race, about trust, about ability? He shook the thought loose. Reeves came through again. Right, you're doing solid. Let's run a simulated descent now. Nothing sudden, just prep for eventual approach. I'm sending coordinates. Shaq followed instructions, angle by angle, foot pressure by hand movement. It felt mechanical, but also deeply personal. Each movement wasn't just flying, it was protecting, leading, answering a call nobody had actually made, but everyone needed him to hear. The cockpit's quiet was suddenly pierced by a low alert tone. Not an emergency, just a system status. But Shaq tensed for a moment, eyes scanning. He adjusted accordingly, reassured by the feedback in his headset. You corrected before I even told you, said Reeves. You've got instincts. No, Shaq said. I've got people behind me. And that was the difference. He wasn't flying to impress. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He just refused to let them fall. This section deepens the mystery and tension, while keeping the story crisp, emotional, and tightly written without physical violence. The pacing and suspense are built around discovery and psychological weight. The cockpit had begun to feel less foreign. Shaq now moved with a strange blend of athletic precision and improvised certainty, responding to the flight instructor's voice with the kind of discipline honed in years of high-stakes play. But even as the plane's system stabilized under his massive hands, a sense of unease crept in, different from the fear of flying or the weight of responsibility. This was quieter, colder, the kind of feeling that comes when you realize something isn't adding up. They'd said the pilot collapsed. Medically. No warning. No signs. But Shaq had seen enough real-life emergencies, on courts in neighborhoods, in crises, to recognize when something was off. The man hadn't slumped like someone who fainted. He had dropped like someone who'd been pulled from within. There was a subtle wrongness to it, that gnawed at the edges of his focus. The instructor was mid-sentence when Shaq's eyes drifted to the lower console. A compartment slightly ajar, small red LED blinking faintly beneath a latch. He reached forward and opened it gently, revealing a slim, matte black voice recorder unit, standard equipment for every cockpit, but rarely reviewed mid-flight unless something went wrong. He paused, then pressed play. The voice that emerged wasn't calm. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the pilot's rushed whispering, recorded just minutes before the flight. If anything happens, I didn't eat anything strange, didn't feel sick, but I found a note in my hotel room, said this flight wouldn't land. No signature, no trace, just a threat. Then silence. Shaq's hand froze above the device. The pit in his stomach dropped deeper. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't random. Someone had intended for this flight to never reach the ground. His fingers hovered, ready to rewind, but the instructor broke through his headset again, oblivious. All right, we're adjusting descent plans again. Dallas still looks clear, but we've got some crosswinds on approach. Read your nav beacon, then maintain heading 045. Shaq answered instinctively, performing the actions like second nature, but his mind was elsewhere. That note, a threat. Why hadn't the pilot reported it earlier? Or had he? Maybe someone had tried to silence it. The cockpit door creaked open behind him, and he quickly switched off the recorder, slipping it back into the console just as a flight attendant leaned in. We've got someone asking to speak to the captain. Said he used to work for the FAA, retired, claims he can help. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Name? Connor Bryce. She replied. Shaq nodded. Seat number?
2-4-8.
He didn't say yes or no, just absorbed the information, and waved her off gently. Thanks. Tell him I'll reach out if I need him. When the door closed again, Shaq let out a long breath. The voices behind the curtain weren't just nervous passengers anymore. Somewhere in that crowd might be a threat. Someone who'd issued that warning. Someone who had no intention of making it to Dallas. He kept one hand on the yoke while his mind raced through the cabin layout, remembering faces, words, reactions. The man in the blazer who had lashed out earlier. The woman who screamed about hijacking. The teen wrongly accused. The retired FAA official who now wanted access to the cockpit. Too many variables. He couldn't afford assumptions. But he could observe. Captain, Reeves said in his ear, you were flying steady. Nice correction on the elevation drift. Tell me something. How's the crew holding up? Shaq didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed locked on the horizon, but his mind was elsewhere. They're doing what they can. But I think we've got another issue. You talking systems? No, Shaq said slowly. Something else. Something human. Reeves didn't respond at first. When he did, it was cautious. You want to share? Not yet, Shaq said. I'm still watching. And he was. Every slight movement, every request to stand, every whisper too faint to reach the cockpit. The cabin had gone from a pressure chamber of fear to a puzzle of motives. People were calming down, but sometimes calm was just camouflage. He reached for the flight manifest next, scanning it quickly. One name jumped out. Seat 9C. Braden Kessler, a known digital activist, had testified before Congress 2 years ago on air traffic vulnerability. Shaq remembered the clip. Kessler had warned that if someone really wanted to take down a plane without violence, they wouldn't need bombs, they'd just need enough code, enough misdirection. And now Kessler was on this flight? Shaq adjusted the autopilot for altitude control, buying himself mental space. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was nothing. But the recorder's message said otherwise. This wasn't just a sick pilot. It was a setup, and the closer they got to Dallas, the more it felt like walking a tightrope above an empty stadium. He knew better than to panic the passengers again. He'd seen what fear did, how it turned people into enemies. No, he'd keep it quiet. For now. But he'd be ready, watching every move, listening for anything out of place. Because this plane wasn't just carrying lives. It was carrying a secret. This part sustains the suspense while introducing new elements of mystery and character suspicion, building toward the story's twist without breaking narrative flow or resorting to physical conflict. The light in the cockpit had taken on a sterile glow, part sunlight, part screen reflection. Outside, the sky was clear, but Shaq knew the clarity was deceptive. Trouble wasn't always in the weather. Sometimes, it was already on board. He adjusted the altitude slightly as instructed, then pressed the headset. Control, I need access to the full passenger manifest. Names, seat assignments, flagged security histories, anything you've got. Something about this flight doesn't add up. There was a pause on the other end. Then the calm voice of Reeves returned. Copy that. I'll ping TSA liaison. Stand by. Shaq used the moment to steady his hands on the yoke. His mind was running faster than the engines. He hadn't told Reeves about the voice recorder yet. Something in his gut told him not to. Not until he had more than one clue. Anyone could be listening. And if there was a threat on board, feeding information to the wrong voice might be a mistake with no undo button. Reeves came back a minute later. Got your manifest. Patching it through to the cockpit console now. One moment. The flight deck display flickered, then populated with rows of names and seat numbers. Shaq scanned the list quickly. Most looked routine. Business travelers, families, a few celebrities under pseudonyms. Then one line made him stop. The footnote under his name was longer than most. Former cybercrime convict, released on parole 3 weeks ago, served 7 years for government system breach, flying under an alias flagged during booking, but cleared under parole travel exemption. Shaq blinked. Flying under an alias. False name. Economy seat. Silent the entire flight. That couldn't be coincidence. Not after the pilot's recorded warning. Not after the note. He tapped the headset again. What do we know about Kane's history? Reeves replied. Pretty deep background. Hacked into a military drone database in 2018. Never proved he caused damage, but he accessed critical systems. Known to travel under different names, mostly for anonymity. His parole terms allow monitored travel, supposedly GPS tagged. Shaq's voice dropped low. Does anyone know where he is right now? Another pause. Not unless you check. Shaq didn't hesitate. He locked the controls into temporary autopilot mode, set for course and altitude, then left the cockpit with a short nod to the attendant stationed nearby. Watch the door. Nobody else gets in. He moved down the aisle slowly, scanning rows with a calculated calm. Passengers looked up as he passed, some with recognition, some with hope, others with veiled suspicion. His presence was too large to ignore. It settled like gravity. Row 32, right side, window seat. The man in 32D sat motionless, legs tucked in slightly, arms crossed, head resting against the side wall. Middle-aged, slim build, dark stubble along his jaw, a plain baseball cap shadowing his eyes. He didn't look up. Shaq stopped beside the row, not speaking, just watching. The man stirred slightly, opening one eye. You Kane? Shaq asked, voice neutral. The man didn't flinch. My boarding pass says Michael Hance. Shaq didn't move. Yeah, but I know you're Russell Kane. Finally, the man turned fully to face him. I haven't touched a system in years. I'm not your problem. No? Shaq asked, raising an eyebrow. Then what are you doing on a flight where the pilot got threatened and collapsed right before takeoff? Kane swallowed but didn't break. I don't know anything about that. I didn't even check the cockpit when we took off. I don't care who flies this plane as long as I get where I'm going. Shaq watched him a beat longer. No sign of panic, no tension in his limbs, just weariness, maybe regret, or maybe a well-rehearsed act. I'm watching you, Shaq said simply, then moved on. 4 rows later, he noticed something else. A woman in her early 40s, blonde hair pulled tight in a bun, glasses perched neatly on her nose, jittering in her seat. Not scared jittering, hiding something. Her hands moved too quickly, fidgeting with a magazine she wasn't reading. Her eyes darted to the lavatory, then back to her lap. Shaq approached. She looked up, startled. Ma'am, he said quietly. Everything okay? She hesitated. Fine. Just nervous about flying. You've been to the bathroom 3 times in the last hour. She blinked. Is that illegal? No. But it's unusual. She stiffened. Clearly caught. But her voice didn't rise in panic. It lowered, like someone who knew how to control a situation. I have anxiety. Motion sickness. If you're going to question every passenger who moves, we'll never get down from here. Shaq didn't back down. What's your name? She hesitated a fraction of a second too long. Lauren Stokes. Shaq scanned the manifest on his phone. Seat. Lauren Stokes was listed, but the note beside it said primary alias suspected. Verified under fast-track clearance. 2 people. 2 aliases. 1 flight. Shaq nodded slowly. Just stay seated. He moved forward again, eyes tracing faces, backs of heads, even the small interactions between rows. Suspicion lived in the smallest gaps. Unspoken tension, awkward exchanges, too quiet stares. The atmosphere wasn't boiling, but it was simmering. In the forward galley, the lead flight attendant pulled him aside. "Something else," she whispered. "We've got a bag. Unclaimed. Found it in the overhead bin near row 16. No tag, no name." "Open it?" Shaq asked. We scanned it. Close. 2 USB drives. One is encrypted. We locked it in the service cabinet. Shaq's instincts flared again. Random bag. Hidden digital devices. Passengers with false names. A pilot with a threatening note. He pressed the headset again. "Reeves, I think this wasn't an isolated incident. Someone wanted this flight to be vulnerable. Maybe not to crash it, but to test how far they could go." Reeves paused. "That's above my pay grade. But if what you're saying is right, you're sitting in a floating chessboard." Shaq exhaled. "And I don't know who's playing." He returned to the cockpit, shutting the door behind him, and took his seat, hands back on the controls. The sky was still open, stretching forward. But inside the plane, the world had shrunk to shadows and whispers. He didn't have answers yet, but now he had suspects. And the game was still in motion. This part introduces a major twist, revealing a deeper layer of the plot and pushing the story into heightened suspense while maintaining emotional realism and cinematic pacing. Shaq had returned to the cockpit with a map of suspicions, but no clear direction. The plane was holding steady, cruising eastward under a veil of calm. Yet the weight on his shoulders wasn't just aerodynamic. It was psychological. The manifest had exposed patterns that didn't fit: passengers flying under aliases, unclaimed devices, a voice recording of a threat. The picture was getting clearer, but the frame still hid its motive. Then came the knock. Light. Rhythmic. 3 taps on the cockpit door. Shaq reached for the intercom. "Yes?" A quiet voice replied. "It's Natalie from seat 14B. I think I can help." He hesitated. Natalie hadn't raised alarms earlier, hadn't panicked, protested, or drawn attention. She'd watched, listened. That alone set her apart. He unlocked the door. She stepped in. Early 30s, dark hoodie, sharp eyes. She held something in her hands, a slim rectangular laptop, the kind designed for power more than convenience. "I didn't want to say this out loud in the cabin," she said, voice low but urgent. "But I saw something weird with the recorder you found. That wasn't just a cockpit voice recorder. I used to work in aircraft systems programming. I recognized the casing." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You saw it?" "I only needed a glimpse." She opened her laptop. Black casing. Non-standard LED pattern. "That model isn't FAA issued. It's a modified signal interceptor." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" "Meaning it can record, but it can also block, jam, redirect. Whoever put that thing in here didn't just want to monitor what the pilot said. They wanted to block external signals, reroute frequencies." Shaq leaned back, absorbing the information like a blow to the chest. "So someone jammed this plane. Temporarily." "Yeah," Natalie said, "and possibly more than once. Which means someone knew exactly what they were doing." She tapped on her laptop again, scanning frequencies. Then her brow furrowed. "There's still something broadcasting right now. Low level. Not from the cockpit." Shaq locked eyes with her. "Where?" Natalie didn't answer. She pointed to the passenger area. They moved quickly. Back through the narrow hallway, into the cabin. Shaq kept Natalie behind him. Not because she was fragile, but because if anything happened, he was the one who could take the fallout. She carried the laptop in front of her like a divining rod. The signal peaked mid-cabin.
Row 18.
They stopped at the overhead compartment. Natalie held the laptop up. "It's coming from in here." Shaq opened it. Inside, a small gray duffel, plain and untagged. He remembered seeing it earlier. It had been logged as unclaimed, but not flagged as dangerous. He pulled it down slowly, carefully, then handed it to Natalie. She placed it on the fold-down tray and unzipped it with cautious fingers. Inside was clothing, chargers, toiletries, and tucked beneath the folded hem of a t-shirt, a small metallic rectangle with a blinking blue light. No screen, no buttons, just a pulse like a mechanical heartbeat. "There," Natalie said, lifting it out with surgical precision. "This is the jammer." Shaq didn't blink. "Can you kill it?" She nodded, opening a side program. "It's low-tech, shielded but traceable. Somebody wanted it hidden but didn't want to risk it being found on their person." Shaq turned to the nearest passenger. "Whose bag is this?" The man looked up, middle-aged, glasses askew, oxygen mask clutched in one hand. He didn't respond. "Sir?" Natalie asked. "Is this yours?" Still no answer. He blinked, confused. Sweat pooled on his brow. Shaq leaned closer. "He's out of it." Natalie frowned. "I think he's drugged." Shaq nodded slowly. "Which means someone planted this." He looked down at the device again. The soft blinking, the smooth casing. It was purpose-built. No brand, no identifiers, just utility. Natalie disabled it with a few keystrokes. "It's off, but it was sending data before I blocked it. To where, I don't know. This wasn't meant to crash the plane." Shaq stared at her. "Then what was it meant to do?" She hesitated. "Maybe, observe, or test vulnerability. This feels like a dry run." Shaq's voice dropped. "For something bigger? Could be. Or it could be a statement. Whoever did this wants to show they can." They returned the device to the service area, locked it up, then returned to the cockpit. Shaq sat in the pilot's seat, hands back on the controls. Natalie remained behind him, perched near the hatch like a sentinel. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" Shaq asked quietly. Natalie looked out the window. "Because I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me. I've seen too many situations where the loudest voices get all the attention, and the smartest ones are ignored." Shaq nodded. He understood that, too well. "Thank you," he said. She offered a small, grim smile. "You're doing better than a lot of trained pilots would." Shaq didn't respond. He stared at the horizon, steady, blinding blue, and knew that the sky was only half the battle. Somewhere below, someone had planned this, calculated it, executed it. The passengers still didn't know. Most were calm now, settled into a tense silence. But Shaq knew that calm was built on trust, and trust built on illusion. He didn't know the full scope yet. He didn't know what the endgame was. But he knew the intent. This flight had been chosen, and not for where it was going, but for what it represented. Here is the next section of your story. This is the emotional and narrative climax, written with heightened suspense and layered emotion, while remaining grounded, suspenseful, and free of physical violence. The sky outside had softened to a bruised blue. Afternoon light, thinning into evening haze, as Flight 708 crossed into final airspace. Below, the Texas landscape sprawled wide and sun-baked, winding roads and dry fields, threading across the distance like veins. In the cockpit, Shaq's jaw had tightened, not from fear but focus. The plane was heavy in his hands now, not just because of the metal it carried, but because of everything riding on the next hour. Fuel was low, lower than it should have been. That was the first red flag. Reeves, still calm in Shaq's headset, confirmed it. "We're registering abnormal fuel usage. We're not in the red yet, but your margin's almost gone. We've cleared emergency priority landing at Dallas-Fort Worth. You'll have runway access in 36 minutes. Shaq nodded once, keeping his eyes on the instruments. "Copy that." Still holding altitude. Adjusting to conserve. "Affirmative. We'll guide you in." But the voice, steady as it was, couldn't mask the undertone. This was close. Too close. And if anything else slipped, if anything else went wrong, the ending could tilt. They had one shot. Behind him, Natalie remained in the jump seat, quiet but alert. She'd been monitoring the device they'd found, analyzing the data packets before the jammer had gone offline. Her conclusion hadn't changed. Someone had used the flight for more than just disruption. It had been a message, encoded through fear. Shaq shifted in his seat and adjusted the angle, lowering altitude in slow degrees. "Begin descent," Reeves said. "Keep speed level. No sudden changes." Shaq responded, hands gliding over the controls. The hum of the engines adjusted slightly, the horizon dropping as the nose dipped toward Earth. And that's when the second red flag hit. A passenger buzzed the flight attendant panel, requesting urgent communication with the cockpit. Name Connor Bryce, the retired FAA agent who had claimed earlier he could help. The same one who hadn't stirred during the earlier chaos, but now wanted access. The request was denied. Then Bryce stood up on his own and walked to the front of the cabin. The flight attendant intercepted him halfway. "Sir, please return to your seat. I need to speak to the captain," Bryce said firmly. It's important. Shaq was informed. His response was instant. Keep him seated. Calmly. Natalie looked up. You think it's him? I think it's a setup, Shaq said. Or a confession. And he was right. Because moments later, the intercom buzzed, and a message came through. Not from Reeves, but the flight crew. Shaq, the attendant whispered, her voice shaking. He's not resisting. He just handed me a letter. He says you'll understand everything if you read it before we land. Natalie took the note as Shaq adjusted descent. She read it aloud. Voice steady. To whoever finds this, I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted someone to see, to notice. The systems are broken. The world ignores us. I served my time. I worked for them. And I watched them cover up things no one should have survived. This was never about violence. It was about truth. I disabled the co-pilot's assignment. I delayed a replacement. I planted the jammer, not to crash the plane, but to see how long it would take before someone noticed. Before someone actually cared. Natalie stopped, glancing up. He signs it, Bryce. Shaq exhaled, long and slow. So this was a test run. An expose. A message, Natalie added. Sent through silence. Shaq pressed the intercom. Tell him to sit. No cuffs. No drama. Just keep him seated until we land. Then he clicked over to Reeves. We've got a motive. Former FAA agent. Says this was his way of forcing a spotlight on the system. Reeves sighed. You landing this plane just became more than an emergency. It's about optics now. You're about to touch down on live news feeds, Mr. O'Neill. I don't care about news feeds. Shaq replied. I care about the people back there. Then he did something no one expected. He picked up the cabin PI. The light blinked. The chime rang out. And the passengers heard the voice of a man they all knew. Not as a pilot, but as a player, a celebrity, a figure they never thought would stand between them and death. This is Shaquille O'Neal, he said. You all know that already. What you don't know is that we've been through something together up here. Something deeper than turbulence. He paused. Not for effect, but to gather truth. We were tested. Not just by fear, but by each other. Some of you got scared. Some of you doubted. Some of you looked at someone else and saw a threat. But we made it through. And we're still flying. The cabin was silent. I want to tell you something now. Because when we land, this story's gonna hit headlines. They'll say I flew a plane, that I saved lives. That's only half the truth. He looked over at Natalie, who nodded silently. The truth is, someone wanted to make a statement today. And yeah, they messed with systems. They caused fear. But the bigger threat wasn't the machine. It was division, distrust. How quick we are to blame, to judge, to assume the worst about each other. He took a breath. I'm flying this plane, yeah. But you're the reason it's still in the air. Because you stayed in your seats. Because you didn't riot. Because you let me try. The intercom was quiet for a beat. Then he added, softer now. When we touch down, I want you to remember that. Not my name. Not what you saw on TV. Just this moment, when strangers trusted each other long enough to survive. He put the handset down. Natalie blinked, then whispered, you just told them everything. No, Shaq said. I just reminded them who they were. The final descent began. Air traffic control called in vectors. Shaq adjusted pitch, drop, speed. The ground rose up beneath them, like a rising wave. Every movement was critical now. Reeves counted him through. 10 miles out, 4,000 feet. Landing gear deployed. Winds, mild. Approach steady. Then they broke through the last cloud layer, and the runway came into view. Long, black, gleaming, with heat and sun. Shaq steadied the nose. Natalie monitored the trim. The passengers sat, in breathless unity, hands clutched, hearts loud. 500 feet. 200. Main gear touched with a thump. Nose gear followed. Reverse thrust activated. Slowed. Steady. Stopped. The cabin erupted. Not in cheers, but in tears. In hands gripped tight. In stunned silence. And Shaq? He just breathed. Hard. Deep. Alive. This resolution holds emotional gravity and narrative closure, while setting the stage for introspection, justice, and a larger message beyond heroism. The wheels had met the runway with a heavy, welcome thud. The kind that said, you're home, even if you'd never been to this city before. The engines whined down. The brakes hissed. The fuselage gently trembled as momentum gave way to stillness. Flight 708 had survived. In the cockpit, Shaq sat motionless, his hands still on the yoke. He hadn't spoken since the landing. Not to Natalie, not to Reeves, not even to himself. The final seconds had passed in a tunnel of focus, all instinct, no ego, and now that it was over, a flood of everything he hadn't allowed himself to feel came pressing behind his eyes. He pulled the headset off and placed it on the panel, as if closing the chapter with a single gesture. Behind the sealed cockpit door, the sounds began to rise. The faintest rustle of passengers unbuckling. A few gasps, not from fear but relief. Then came a quiet sob. Then another. And then, a slow building applause. Not loud, not celebratory, but grateful, raw, unrehearsed. Natalie, sitting behind him, exhaled and leaned back, arms folded across her chest. That, she said quietly, wasn't just landing a plane. Shaq nodded once, still not speaking. He stood up, opened the door to the cabin, and stepped out. The aisle was filled with faces, changed, softer, red-eyed. Some were crying, some were just watching him. A child waved. A man near the back put his hand to his heart. Not one flashbulb. Not yet. This moment wasn't for spectacle. It was for breath. The flight attendants quickly moved into gear, opening the cabin doors as ground crew approached with stairways and medical personnel. Emergency vehicles stood by, routine for unplanned landings, but no one was rushed. There was no stretcher, no sirens, just a line of professionals waiting to witness what they'd already heard through tower radio. Shaq waited as the passengers disembarked row by row. He didn't speak unless spoken to. A few shook his hand. One woman hugged him and whispered, "You reminded me we're not alone." The teen from earlier, the one wrongly accused, nodded to him with a kind of silent dignity. Words weren't needed. Bryce, the former FAA agent, walked out under escort. He didn't resist, didn't explain, but he glanced at Shaq on his way down the steps, and said only, "You did what I hoped someone would do." Shaq didn't reply. He just nodded, once. Outside, the heat of the tarmac wrapped around him as he stepped off the plane last. The camera crews had already begun to form a perimeter. Microphones, lights, shouts. But he didn't stop. He didn't speak. He walked past them all, with his head high, eyes forward, like a man who knew that stories are made in silence as much as in sound. A security official tried to intercept. "Mr. O'Neill, we've got a press zone." Shaq cut him off gently. "Let them tell their version. I've already lived mine." He was guided inside the terminal, away from the press, into a quiet holding area where law enforcement began processing statements. The FBI had already stepped in, and federal agents arrived in suits, asking for the cockpit recordings, passenger lists, device logs. Shaq handed it all over, including Natalie's tech findings. She answered questions calmly, professionally, like someone used to translating code into truth. An agent pulled Shaq aside. "You're going to be the headline. Big Shaq saves plane. Be ready." Shaq shook his head. "Don't make this about fame. Make it about the system that cracked enough to let this happen." The agent studied him. "You think the guy's a terrorist?" Shaq looked toward the terminal windows where Bryce was being quietly questioned. "I think he was desperate. I think he wanted to be heard. And I think he chose the wrong way to do it." "But you're not angry." Shaq turned back. "I've been black in America long enough to understand that not everyone who breaks a rule is trying to break the world. Some people are trying to fix it with the only tools they've got left." The agent said nothing, just scribbled in his notebook. Later, when they finally let him go, he exited through a private security corridor. But even there, news had leaked. A small group had gathered near the gates. Travelers, staff, crew, waiting just to catch a glimpse. Some clapped softly. Some just watched. No one asked for a selfie. And Shaq? He paused only once, to place his massive hand on the shoulder of a young TSA agent, who looked no older than 20. "You doing okay?" Shaq asked. The agent blinked. "Yeah, I watched it. On the monitor. Everything." Shaq nodded, then walked away. Later that night, the news did what it always did. Hero in the sky, Shaquille O'Neal pilots jet to safety. An NBA legend saves hundreds. The flight that shouldn't have landed. Footage played in loops. Interviews aired with passengers who cried on cue. A viral clip showed the intercom speech, his voice broadcast across the cabin like prophecy. Hashtag spread, brands offered endorsements, networks requested exclusives. But Shaq gave no interviews. He sat in a quiet hotel room, TV off, phone on silent, eyes watching the Texas skyline through a wall of glass. It wasn't pride he felt, or exhaustion. It was clarity. This wasn't about planes, or fear, or technology. It was about people, and how close we'd come to forgetting we're responsible for one another. Natalie texted once. A simple message. Still processing. Thank you for listening. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't need to. He reached into his duffel, pulled out a small notebook, and scribbled one line. The most dangerous turbulence we face isn't in the air. It's in us. This closing chapter delivers emotional resonance, thematic clarity, and lasting depth, not with spectacle, but with meaning and transformation. The auditorium was old. Paint chipped on the corners, chairs squeaking under too much weight, and too little funding. It smelled faintly of dust and wax, the kind of space used for assemblies, talent shows, and lectures from people the world forgot about. But today the room buzzed with a different kind of anticipation. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the front, in front of a simple folding table. No cameras, no banners, just a man, his voice, and 200 students from a public school in the middle of the city's hardest-hit district. The principal had introduced him briefly, careful not to reduce him to celebrity, but the kids already knew who he was. Not because of basketball, not even because of the news. They knew because they recognized something in him. Size, yes, but also presence, gravity. Like the air itself paused when he entered. He looked across their faces now, bright-eyed, skeptical, half bored, half curious, and waited until the shuffling stopped. Then he began. Let me tell y'all a story, he said. Not about hoops, not about being famous, about flying. A few eyebrows raised. Couple weeks ago, he continued, I was on a flight. Just a regular flight. No red carpet, no first-class bubble, just people, families, business travelers, nervous flyers. And halfway through, something happened. He paused. The pilot collapsed. Mid-air. The co-pilot never showed. The cockpit was empty. The crew froze. Nobody knew what to do. A girl near the front gasped. A boy 2 rows back muttered, Dang. Shaq smiled slightly. Now let me ask you something. If you were in that plane, and someone asked you to step into the cockpit, would you do it? A few kids raised their hands. Some smirked. Others looked away. I did, he said simply. Not 'cause I wanted to, not 'cause I thought I could, but 'cause nobody else would. He took a slow breath. And I flew that plane. Murmurs now, wide eyes. But he didn't let it linger. Here's the thing though, he said. That story ain't about being a hero. It's about what got us there. See, someone on that flight wanted it to crash. Not with bombs, not with guns, with silence, with fear, with division. He walked a few steps closer to the students. People started turning on each other, blaming strangers, whispering suspicions. One guy said he wouldn't sit next to a black teenager. Another woman screamed about terrorists. And you know what I saw? He waited, then said it soft but strong. I saw what fear does when we stop seeing each other. The room stilled. I flew that plane because someone had to, he said. But I landed it because people chose to calm down, chose to trust, chose to listen. And you know what that taught me? He looked at the back row now. At a kid in a hoodie slouched low, pretending not to care. You don't need wings to lift someone. You just need to show up when it counts. He let that sit. I used to think saving lives meant pulling people out of burning buildings, making game-winning shots, big gestures. But sometimes, saving lives means facing the ones you couldn't save, living better because of them. He turned slightly, and the auditorium faded for a moment, in his mind, replaced by smoke, by screams, by a fire from long ago. The rec center, the boy he couldn't reach. He blinked it back. Sometimes, he continued, it means sitting in a room like this, with people like y'all, and saying, you matter, you can fly, and you don't have to crash just 'cause the world told you you would. A teacher wiped her eyes. A boy who'd been playing with his shoelace sat up straighter. Shaq leaned on the edge of the table now, more relaxed, more real. Y'all think this world's fair? It ain't. I know what it's like to walk in a room and get judged before you speak. To be called too big, too black, too loud. To be feared when you're just trying to help. But I also know what it means to carry someone else's fear. And still keep walking. He looked around. Y'all know that feeling. The nods were quiet. But they came. He smiled gently. That's what makes you stronger than the people judging you. Not the fight. Not the clapback. The restraint. The knowing. The doing good anyway. A hand rose slowly in the back. A boy. Lanky. Nervous. Did you forgive the guy who messed with the plane? Shaq nodded slowly. I did. Why? 'Cause rage ain't gonna fix what broke him, he said. He didn't want to hurt people. He wanted to wake them. And yeah, it was wrong. Dangerous. But I saw what made him do it. He pointed at the kids. Same thing that makes some of y'all give up before you even try. Same thing that makes you believe you ain't worth saving. Then, softer now, you are. The silence after that wasn't empty. It was full of emotion, of reflection, of realization. Shaq stood straight again, glancing toward the exit. They call me Big Shaq. They say I saved a flight. But the truth? I was just a man in a chair who said yes. Said I'll try. He walked toward the door, then paused. You don't have to be famous. You don't have to be fearless. You just have to be ready. He left the room in silence. No applause. Just presence. Just the echo of what he'd said lingering like a scent. Subtle, but undeniable. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Traffic humming. Sirens distant. Kids laughing in alleyways between classes. Shaq stepped into the sunlight, stretching his arms once like a man who'd carried too much for too long. He didn't know if the kids would remember everything, but he knew they'd remember enough. And sometimes, that's all it takes to make someone choose not to crash, but to soar. If this story moved you, don't just watch the skies. Start listening between the silences. Every choice you make writes a chapter in someone else's flight. Stay alert, stay human, and remember, the next time the world starts shaking, you might be the one we're all waiting to stand up.